Welcome, I'm Jim Falk. Now, you may be surprised that the deadliest conflict in the world is not in the Middle East or in Ukraine, but in Sudan, one of the poorest countries in the world and the third largest in Africa. The United Nations estimates that over one half of Sudan's population, which is 50 million, is facing hunger, millions have been displaced, and sexual violence is rampant with child soldiers on the front lines. Recognizing that Sudan has been conflict-ridden for years, despite significant efforts of peacekeeping, it's understandable to ask, one, why should we care? And two, can the United States play a constructive role to build a path towards peace? Now, to help us understand the roots of the war and bring, I hope, some clarity to the current situation, let's bring in our two experts. Ambassador Mark Asquino had a 37-year Foreign Service career with assignments in Latin America, Europe, Central Asia, and Africa. In fact, he was the Deputy Chief of Mission at the U.S. Embassy in Sudan from 2008 to 2010. Bringing in-depth knowledge of the humanitarian crisis and how it's being addressed is Julie Gregory. She's a research analyst with Protecting Civilians and Human Security at the Stimson Center. Previously, Julie worked at the Carter Center, Mercy Corps, and the Office of the United Nations Ombudsman Mediation Services. So let's get started. Thank you so much for being with us. This is such an important and overlooked topic. Julie, I use the word overlooked. Why aren't people paying more attention?
So it is true that we don't tend to see many headlines about Sudan in the United States. But unfortunately, there's a massive humanitarian crisis happening right now that does deserve our collective attention. Part of the reason we may not be seeing more in US media about it is that President Biden, in his term so far, has not spoken about Sudan frequently. But since the war erupted in April 2023, fighting between the Sudanese armed forces, the country's military, and the Rapid Support Forces, a paramilitary force formerly part of the government, has devastated the country, impacting Sudanese civilians around the territory. Over the past year and a half, thousands of civilians have been targeted and killed, with estimates ranging between 20,000 to well over 100,000 civilians.
And the numbers are staggering. And give us a sense of who is being most affected. Are we talking about militants that are being killed, women, children?
That's a great question. This war is having a severe impact on civilians. So we're talking men, women, and children. The fighting has destroyed homes, schools, hospitals, markets, and water sources across the country. Soldiers have targeted based on gender and ethnicity. And as you mentioned earlier, sexual violence has been used as a weapon of war. This is the largest humanitarian catastrophe the country has seen and the largest displacement and hunger crisis in the world today. To put this in perspective, over 11 million people, that's about 1/5 of the country's population, has been forcibly displaced by the fighting, with 3 million having to flee to neighboring countries.
Ambassador Asquino, it's complicated. Help our viewers understand. I mean, Sudan has been independent since 1956. That's a long time, but it's rarely been stable. We don't have time in this program to go through all the different wars, but what happened last year, I believe in April, to ignite this region again?
Well, this all goes back to a successful coup, Jim, against the long-term serving dictator al-Bashir in 2019. And this was fueled by people, and the army originally backed al-Bashir, but then the chief of staff, General Abdel Fattah Burhan, decided to put his lot in with the people. And he became head of a transitional military council. Now, the idea of this was that this would go to elections in 2023. His deputy was a notorious warlord, as you said. head of the Rapid Support Forces, Lieutenant General Mohammed Hamdan, who everybody calls Hamati. And so they, for a time, had a civilian prime minister, international civil servant by the name of Abdullah Hamda. But they got rid of him, they pushed him out, and the two of them decided, cancel the elections, and then decided to share power. They had a falling out in 2003, and that is the origin of the Civil War. Both sides accuse the other of having been the ones to attack. But at the end of the day, both wanted absolute power. And so that is the origin of this horrible war that is ongoing, Jim.
So, Julie, when we think about a civil war, we think about perhaps different ethnic groups, ethnicities, religion. I know that Sudan has a population that I believe, what is 70% Arab and then 30% Black African. Is that, are those numbers accurate? And is this conflict in part due to ethnic conflict?
So what I can say is that we have seen targeting of civilians based on their ethnicity. So primarily we've seen this from the Rapid Support Forces, who have been targeting non-Arab civilian populations, including ethnic Masalites. Just to put this in perspective, in 2023, in the city of El Geneina, 10,000 to 15,000 civilians were killed by the Rapid Support Forces, and a good portion of those were ethnic Masalites. So yes, that's something we're definitely seeing in the conflict.
Let me interrupt and ask, when you say non-Arab, is that non-Muslim? Are we talking
that
about?
Means based on an Arab ethnicity. So another way of saying that could be identified Black African communities.
Okay. So another thing that I find just so perplexing about this is we know politics can make strange bedfellows, but we have, in this case, Egypt and Iran supporting one group and UAE supporting another. Ambassador, help me understand that. I don't see Iran and Egypt as being friends.
Well, they are not, and you have to break that down. General Burhan did part of his military training in Egypt and has close ties with President al-Sisi. And from the Egyptian point of view, al-Sisi would be happy to see another military strongman ruling in Sudan. When it comes to Iran, Iran views this in a broad geopolitical fashion. And so it basically is opposed to the UAE and to Saudi Arabia and certainly to Israel. And so it sees value in throwing its lot in behind al-Burhan. Now, as to the UAE and Saudi Arabia, both of them are opposed to an Islamist government, a radical one coming into force in Sudan. And so their interest is in backing the RSF because, at least as far as we know, Hemeti has said if he were to come to power, that it would not be a radical Islamist government. So you have these really kind of complex web of interests going on here. And at the same time, the people of Sudan are the ones who are suffering horribly.
Does the United States have an interest in which side wins, or do they just want to see a cessation of the conflict?
Well, that's an interesting question, Jim, because on a certain level, the United States sees al-Burhan as representing the institutional government. He was chief of staff. On the other hand, he was guilty of horrible atrocities in Darfur during the war there. And he has committed atrocities against civilians as well since he's come to power. So, on the other hand, you have Hemeti, who is a notorious, what we used to call Janjaweed, two Arabic words, one meaning spirit, the other meaning horse. And they were called in Darfur devils on horseback. They committed war crimes. So at the end of the day, the United States would like to see a return to civilian rule. Hamdok, who was the prime minister, would be a good choice. But the immediate end of all of this, Jim, is to make sure that the hostilities come to a stop.
You are absolutely correct. We need to care because no one else is fighting for the people of Sudan. The Sudanese population is entirely impacted by this conflict. They did not start or want this conflict. This is a conflict being led between two generals, and that needs to be remembered and emphasized. This is not what the Sudanese people fought for when they sought to overthrow al-Bashir from his authoritarian rule. They want a democracy, and they want to be able to lead fulfilling lives just like everyone else. But unfortunately, the international community is not giving enough attention or applying enough pressure when it comes to Sudan.
Well, is that just because we've thrown up our hands? I mean, when you say pressure, what? And also you say that the Sudanese people did not want this, but clearly the warlords have support, or there wouldn't be people fighting.
That's true. There are incentives that the warring parties have given to allied militias to join their forces. There's also a lot of mis and disinformation circulating. But one benefit that allied militias see is that they're able to loot those areas that they conquer. So there's definite economic benefit in the war for the warring parties and their allied militias, but there's no benefit for Sudanese civilians.
Are there any riches that people are concerned about? Does Sudan have oil, gold? I mean, does that make it strategically more important?
Yes, absolutely. Sudan is very resource rich. It is known as a breadbasket. So before the conflict, it had a lot of agricultural products and was supplying those agricultural products to the Horn of Africa. So this has also had a negative impact regionally, including on food security. We also have quite a few mineral resources in Sudan, which different warring parties are vying over. And it's also important to mention that Russia, through the Wagner Group, which is a private military company, has been in country since 2017 and continues to exploit gold mining resources there.
Ah, that's a way for them to fund the war in Ukraine. Ambassador, tell us more about the regional impact. Julie's talked about displacement of so many civilians. I guess they're crossing borders and perhaps destabilizing other countries.
Yeah, absolutely so, Jim. This is a country that borders on six other regional nations. And to the north, you have Egypt, you have South Sudan, you have Chad, and you're having an enormous outflow of refugees, and Julie can talk more about this, to those countries. And so that is instability being caused. But some of these countries, like Chad, have also gone through a recent difficult government transition, father to son dictatorship. And Chad is being used, for example, for the UAE to ship weapons into Sudan. So this is an enormous problem. And if Sudan becomes, as it is approaching, an ungoverned state, that will have impact throughout Africa because it's such a large country. And it could very easily result in war between Sudan and South Sudan. The two countries have a history of war. So it is tremendously important from a geopolitical perspective that this war come to some sort of end and the people are protected from what's happening to them.
And it's not just the impact on their neighbors. I'm sure that a lot of these displaced folks are trying to get to Europe, and elsewhere.
Absolutely so. Because they're going to countries that in and of themselves are rather poor and unstable, not to be particularly welcomed. So yes, they are going to try to join that great flow that is heading into Europe, and that is destabilizing as well.
So I often turn to Nicholas Kristof with the New York Times, a global columnist, and he says here, I don't understand why President Biden has been so deferential to the UAE. We have much more leverage over the UAE than it does over us. Ambassador, you've been a diplomat. I think you still are. Why can't we get the UAE to stop inciting this conflict?
Well, I think we could come back to what else is happening. The administration has been very focused on Gaza, as we know, focused on Ukraine. Um, and in many ways, they look to maintaining their relationship with the Arab world at a time when that has become really quite difficult because of the Israeli conflict in Gaza and in Lebanon. So I think often as a diplomat, it is where you expend your political capital. As somebody who served for 2 years in Sudan, I think more should have been done. I agree with Nick Kristof, who has always kept Sudan, particularly Darfur, out there in the public space. But it has not happened. And now we come into a new administration, and we will see if they leverage any influence that they have with the UAE and others.
Well, the Lockheed factory is just about 30, 35 miles down the road where the F-35s are constructed, built. Is that not something that we might be able to sort of hang over the UAE's head? I mean, I know they want those planes.
Potentially so, but it is not going to happen in this administration. And in the next administration, of course, you have domestic pressures because what administration really wants to put pressure not only on the UAE in this case, but also on American arms providers and also people making those jets. So it is a combination of foreign policy, but also domestic policy.
Julie, you keep a very close eye on the United Nations, and it was just, I think it was November 19th, that the Security Council attempted to pass a resolution. Remind me who put that resolution forward, but it was vetoed by Russia. Give us just a little bit of background about why the UN has not been able to really have any impact.
Yes, I do keep a very close eye. And on November 18th, the UK and Sierra Leone did put forth a resolution in the Security Council that, had it been passed, would have called for an end to the conflict and for a nationwide ceasefire, among other things. Unfortunately, when it came to the vote, Russia exercised its right to a veto, halting the resolution in its tracks. It's also worth noting that the Security Council has successfully approved two different resolutions in the year since the war has started. But unfortunately, the warring parties have taken no heed of those resolutions, and there has been no material progress in advancing a ceasefire or in other political talks, though the US does remain highly involved in leading talks with the parties, including other countries.
Now, you talked about talks. I know there was some talks in Jeddah and then Geneva, and the parties, the two groups, they didn't even come to those meetings, right?
So the Jeddah talks, which were led by the US and Saudi Arabia, were actually really positive. This was the only time where the warring parties came to an agreement and signed an agreement. This was an agreement around protecting civilians, known as the Jeddah Declaration. Unfortunately, they have not abided by those commitments whatsoever, and they have not been held account for abiding by those commitments, especially with other influential member states sending in arms and funding to the warring parties. Now, more recently, the US has led with other countries talks that occurred in August of 2024. And The rapid support forces did show up in person, but the Sudanese armed forces decided not to attend. So progress was extremely limited. The only real outcome that we saw from those talks was that the rapid support forces agreed to implement a code of conduct for their soldiers.
Quick question. Is starvation being used as a tool of war, Julie?
Yes, well, I would say yes, in my personal capacity. We have definitely seen the destruction of agriculture in this war. And civilians, due to their displacement, have also stopped producing agriculture because they're afraid that tomorrow or the next day, they're going to have to pack up all their belongings and flee to another part of the country or to another country altogether. So we've seen a drastic reduction in agricultural products, and this has led to the massive hunger crisis that we're seeing across the country today.
And we've seen how difficult it is for humanitarian agencies and relief organizations to get food into Gaza, for instance. Are there the same type of obstacles in Sudan?
Yes. The warring parties have not allowed aid into the country in different parts of the war. So, for instance, between February and April of this year, the Sudanese armed forces, the de facto military government, did not allow aid to come in through the border crossing with Chad. Now, this had a huge impact on the Darfur region, and it led to the hunger crisis in part that we're seeing today, as international agencies that are focused on providing food and other life-saving materials were not able to send in aid, let alone ensure that they got to the populations in need.
Ambassador, the word genocide has a strict legal definition. Is genocide is that a fact in Sudan, and who's responsible if so?
Well, you go back to the fact, Jim, that the U.S. government has only used the word genocide once in our history in terms of an active conflict. This was General Colin Powell when he was Secretary of State. And of course, there is the UN Convention going back to 1948 defining genocide. But the US never followed through this was in 2004, on what Colin Powell said. So also the ICC, the Rome Statute, which we signed, the same definition of genocide. But the US, as we know, is not a signatory to the ICC. The ICC has used the term genocide. But as I look at things and I look at that definition of genocide, I go back to Secretary Powell. It does seem to me certainly what the RSF is doing in Darfur on a scale much worse than what happened back in the 2003 war in Darfur is genocide. But the US has been reluctant ever to bring that charge of genocide before the UN and ask for action. And I don't see that as happening. But if I could go back and make two quick points on Russia. After Russia vetoed the motion in the UN Security Council, the Sudanese army commended Russia for the veto and said that it was a sign of how they were respecting their sovereignty. Why is that? Russia is trying to get a base on the Red, and General Burhan is helping to facilitate. If they get that, that would give them significant control of the Suez Canal and also access to the Indian Sea.
We have an interest to stay involved. Julie, what can an average American who's concerned about this, what can they do? Is it giving money to humanitarian organizations? Is it writing their member of Congress?
Absolutely. So funding can be sent directly to Sudanese civilian organizations that are providing social support, food, and shelter to civilians who are at risk of being targeted in the conflict. And also, it's very important to remain engaged politically on this issue for the US. So more pressure needs to be applied to the current and future administration and to Congress as well to ensure that Sudan makes it to the top of the US's priority list, because indeed, we need to achieve a ceasefire in Sudan.
Ambassador, I'll give you another 30 seconds.
Well, back during the war in Sudan, in Darfur, there was a lot of what I would term celebrity diplomacy by the likes of Mia Farrow and George Clooney. And those people actually performed quite a positive in bringing people's attention to what was happening. I think more people need to be engaged and people who have influence. But I would agree with Julie. The average Americans should be writing to their congressmen, and they all should be pointing out how this is impacting the world.
I want to thank you both for being with us, and I hope that we were able to provide some insight to our viewers on what is such a complicated situation. Thank you, Ambassador Asquino. Thank you, Julie Gregory. And as with so many of the world's conflicts, it's taken for granted that the United States can and will take a leadership role in attempting to bring about peace, or at a minimum, a cessation of these horrible hostilities. But more and more, we are seeing evidence that the United States has limited leverage to influence events as other countries exert their influence. Regrettably, here in Sudan, those most adversely impacted are the most marginalized and unable to fend for themselves. I want to thank all of you for watching Perspectives Matter, where we talk about things that matter with people who care.